Hi everyone, welcome to FX PhD. This is Tim Clapham. This is the After Effects for Broadcast Design, Class 3. This week we'll be taking the project that you can see playing in front of you at the moment. I've set that up and we'll be adding particle systems. We'll have a quick look at how I've set this up first of all. And what we'll be doing is using Trapcode Particular. If you don't have this, as it's a third-party effect, go to www.trapcode.com and you can have a look at what the particle system does, and then you can go from there. It links to Red Giant software, which is redgiantsoftware.com, and you can download a demo to follow the class. So let's get started. Okay, so first of all, let's just have a look at how we set this animation up. I've used After Effects 3D layers, and it's kind of quite a simple camera move. We'll go through it step by step. So let's have a look. I'm just going to switch motion blur off so we can kind of scrub through easily. First of all, this motorbike's come whizzing down this jump, camera pans across, then it whizzes across quite fast, and these kind of C's pop up with the cones. The aeroplane flies through, we zoom in, and then we follow these lines up to the kind of final logo. So if we just switch to custom view once, I'm going to select the camera so you can see the path that it takes. Okay, so it starts over here, that's the really fast part, and it zooms in and up. So you can see it's not too complex. You can kind of have a more in-depth look when you get the project yourself. So let's see how I've set up each part. We've got quite a lot to get through, so let's just quickly have a look at this. If you notice at the beginning, we've got these kind of cogs turning, which is just here, as the guy on the motorbike comes down. Now they're turning without keyframes. Basically, they've got a little expression on them, which is this. Okay, and velocity is the only important parameter for us to worry about, and that's basically the speed of the rotation. You could obviously set keyframes for this, but it's just one way of doing it without having to use keys, and it will just basically rotate forever. So the camera moves across, guy on the bike does his little jump, we whiz across, and then we've got these things that pop up with the C surface. So let's just have a look, see how I've made the C. It's a pretty big comp, 3,500. Okay, and what I've done is I've used shape layers to create the surface. And I'll just show you that. First of all, I'm just going to unfold this and just switch off a couple of the elements. If we switch the layer on so we can see what's going on, you can see that there's my one shape layer. It's just a simple ellipse, 55 units. I've then used repeater to repeat it along X. So now we get this row of spheres, which kind of looks like the surface of a sort of cartoony C. And then to give it the wobbly effect, I've used wiggle paths. You add these animation effects by clicking on this pop-up menu. There we go, wiggle paths. If we switch that on, you can see that they all wiggle, which is what we want. I'll just show you the parameters for that. So we've got size 10, smooth points, 1.5 wiggles a second. We can now switch that layer back off because that's actually used as a matte. If we go F4, you can see that we've set that to alpha inverted matte. And there we go. We have our kind of wibbly wobbly C. So back in the main comp, I'm just going to move this up slightly. Okay. You can see we've got 3 layers of the C there. That's the custom view. They're all in a set in Z space. The reason it's so wide is because this layer right at the back, you would see the edges of it when the camera's in the foreground. So I've just made it that wide so you can't ever see the edges. Now I've used an expression on these as well. If we just click to see middle, say, hit U, and I'll show you this expression. There we go. So I've applied this expression to the kind of marker cones that come up and to the sea. What it basically does is it gives it a little bit of inertia, some bounce. This is one that I've downloaded from the internet. The important parameters are these: amplitude, frequency and decay. I think they're quite obvious what they do from the names. We're not going to go into that now, but by all means, when you get the project, have a play around with these and see what difference it actually makes. So by offsetting the markers and the sea, when they all come up and they bounce, you get a really nice effect. I'll just show you that. I'm not sure if you can see that at the frame rate we're grabbing at, but hopefully you can. You can see they all sort of boing upwards. Works quite well. So then we've got this plane that flies across. The camera then zooms in along Z, and these bars appear and travel upwards till we reach the logo. So these bars are shape layers. I've got 3 layers here. If we just select those, fold them down. So if I select one of the paths, you can then see that. And then what I've done is used the trim paths, which comes from this pop-up list again. Basically, you just animate the start or the end point, and you can see it kind of writes on the effect. I've just added in an extra key there, so I'll undo that. So after that, the camera travels along, up the lines, and we have this logo reveal. Again, this is pretty much made from shape layers for the globe part, which are these layers here. And then we have the reef, which we'll have a quick look at. Okay, and you can see it just scales up each set of leaves. And then in the main comp, we've duped that and flipped it round. So there's 2 of them. So there we go. So now we've had a quick look at the project, let's get stuck in and start adding some of the particle effects. First thing I'm going to do is add some clouds into the scene. I'm going to use particular for this. I've set up some cloud comps already. They're all quite similar. They look like this. So the clouds animate across very slightly over 10 seconds. They're all made with shape layers. I've just selected one there so you can see. It's literally just a simple line with a stroke on it, and then I've animated the transform for each separate shape. Now, as we're using it with a particle system, they all need to be in one comp. We can't kind of link 5 comps to one particle system, but there is a workaround for this using our particular. It's pretty clever. Here's my cloud particles composition. It's got all 5 clouds in it now, and it's 50 seconds long. So this is the one we're going to use to create our particles. So let's go back to the main comp. First thing we can do, the first thing I'm actually going to do is just shy these layers. See, I've hit the shy switch for some. It's just going to tidy up the timeline for me a little. I can drag my cloud particles in and hide that at the bottom. And now I'm just going to select a solid, which is full size of the comp. I'm working PAL widescreen. Drag that in just above the background. I've renamed it Particular Clouds. I'm just going to go Effect, Trap Code, Particular. Okay, so that's now added the effect. We can get a little preview here. You can also shift drag to show you what would happen if the emitter's moving. So I need to emit all the particles at the very beginning and then stop the emission, and they need to live for the duration of the comp. So I've jumped to the first frame. I'm just going to open the emitter, and I'm going to set the particles a second to 75 and add a key, then jump forward 1 frame and set that to 0. At the moment it's set to be a point emitter here. We don't want it to be a point because that means all the clouds will come from one specific point. We want them to kind of be emitted over the whole of the comp. So we can set that to box, and then we just need to set the size of the box. Okay, we need to be able to see the particle system really to be able to position it and everything. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to set up the actual particle, because at the moment they're quite small little dots. If we click on here, you can see there's just 3 little particles that are emitted. First of all, I want them to live for the duration of the comp. I'm going to say 10 seconds because that's the length of the actual cloud particle in the pre-comp, if you remember. Particle type we're going to say custom, and then we can select the layer that we want to use, cloud particles. Okay, it's giving us a warning that our particles are too big. We don't really need to worry about that because we're not going to have like millions of them. But obviously if you have got hundreds and thousands and they're big, it's going to use up massive amounts of memory, could cause problems. So we can just ignore this for now. The next thing, under time sampling, it says current time. Now if you remember rightly, the cloud particles composition, which is this one that we've chosen, has got 5 sets of clouds in it. So what we want to do is we want to split the clip. So we choose this option, split clip, play once. And then we can say the number of clips, and we know that there's 5. So what the effect will do is it will take this particle comp layer and it will split it into 5 sections, and each of those sections it will use as a custom particle. It's a great way of being able to have different types of particles that are all animated in one particle system. So let's just switch to a custom view and see if we can see anything that's going on yet, and let's just solo that layer, jump forward 1 frame. Okay, I can see some tiny dots here. Obviously the size is nowhere near high enough. Let's set it to 350. There we go, we can see a kind of small collection of clouds bundled up together. If I scrub through, you can see the clouds are emitted and then they all kind of move in all directions. So let's go back to the emitter settings. Here it's set to uniform, which means it's going to spew the particles out in all directions. Directional is the one I'm going to choose, and I'm going to switch off any spreads so that they don't move at an angle away from the emitter. So now they should all be going in one direction. There you go. Now they're moving backwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to adjust the Y rotation -90 because I want them to move across. Like that, you can see they're kind of moving perpendicular to the camera. Or even parallel to it, sorry. So that looks pretty cool. Let's go back to our active camera. Oh no, sorry. Let's stay in custom view. Let's unsolo this layer. And there we go, we can see our clouds. They're not exactly in the right place yet, so let's go around positioning those. I want to move them right back in Z, so 2,500. Okay, so they're going to be behind everything then. And let's just adjust the size of the emitter. So we drag these values. Okay, and you can see the particles spreading out as we do that, so I'm just going to eyeball it. About 1,000. And the same with height, around 800. And then the Z, which is going to need to be quite big, because we want them kind of covering the full width of the project as the camera moves. So I'm going to go with around 5,000. So if we go to frame 1, you notice there's no particles. They're emitted. And then on frame 2 we can see them. Well, we want them from frame 1, so what I'm going to do is you can set a pre-run on the effect. If you go to particular and click options, there's a pre-run setting up here. I'm just going to set that to 1. What that means is that it emits the particles before the first frame. If I come down here and just zoom in, I can now select these 2 keys and just move them back 1. So that means all the particles will be emitted by the time this layer starts. We know the particles are kind of more or less in the right position now. Let's switch back to our active camera and we can actually see them now in shot 1, which is great. As we move across. Oh, sorry, I'm kind of zoomed right in there. There we go, we can see there's some clouds here as well. They're not exactly in the right position. I think they definitely need to move up. Okay. And maybe across. Maybe a little bit more. Okay. See, they're not too bad, but what we can do now is we can adjust the seed value for the effect, and that will kind of randomise the positions of them, and we can just keep changing that until the clouds are where we want them. So to do that, you just go into options and you adjust this number up here. So if I just put in a random number, you can see they all change. And you can just do that until you're happy with the position of them. Okay, that's not too bad. Almost look a little bit high now, so I've just lowered that down. Okay. I'm just going to switch back to custom view and check it from another angle. Okay, I can see that there's a few particles over here, so maybe my emitter is a little bit too big, so let's just bring that back slightly and maybe move it over. Maybe move it up slightly. Let's have a look back here. Switch back to our active camera. Okay, I think that looks great. So that's the clouds done. One last thing just to switch on that, and that's motion blur. I'm going to use comp settings, but I'm going to set it to subframe sample so we can set the number of samples in the motion blur. I'm going to set that to 32, which may be a little bit high, but it'll mean we'll have a nice smooth motion blur. And then just enable it on the layer. You can actually switch motion blur on in the effect, so it's on all the time. If you use the comp settings, then you can switch it on and off using your normal motion blur comp switch. Okay, so let's move on and add the next part. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some snowflakes. I'm just going to duplicate this clouds comp, rename it snow, hit U, and I'm just going to switch off the keyframes and set this to 10. That's a bit of a guess at the moment. You can see the comp's now filled with clouds. Don't worry, because we're not going to use the clouds for this. If we jump back to the project window, you can see I've got a snowflake comp set up, which is there. It's just 50 by 50. And I'm just going to drag that into the main comp. Switch off the visibility. So let's come back to the particular snow, and I'm going to just adjust a few of the parameters in here. It's pretty much similar to the clouds one, apart from obviously the direction and the fact that we want them to move, and they're going to be a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to adjust the parameters and show you what I've done. Right, I've soloed the layer, switched to custom view so you can just see where I've got to. It's still emitting the cloud particles. What I've done is I've set it to 10 particles a second, and I've changed the position. So it's right over this side because we only want it where the jump is. It's only 2000 in Z. The clouds are 2500, so this is going to sit slightly in front of the clouds. I've adjusted the X rotation to -90 and the Y to -20. If you remember, the clouds are all travelling horizontally. Obviously we want the snowflakes to fall downwards. I've increased the velocity and I've changed the emitter size. I've set the Z value to 1 so that they all emit from the very top. Otherwise we'd have particles emitting all the way down the screen, and we don't want that, so we just want them to come from one point. So if I come to particle type, I can select snowflake, and I'm just going to put that to current time. They're a little bit big. Well, quite a lot too big. I'm just going to set that to say 20. So if we scrub through now, we can see we've got a nice selection of snowflakes. I think they should be quite random in size, so I'm going to put that to 50% random. Let's switch back to our active camera and unsolo that layer. Okay, so we're kind of getting there. We can see some snowflakes. They're not appearing soon enough. We need them to be filling the whole screen from the beginning. So what we can do is we can adjust the pre-run as we did before. So let's just set that to say 75%. Okay, so now we've got particles filling the whole screen. Great stuff. They're a bit static at the moment. To make them look slightly more like snow, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a slight bit of rotation. Put -0.2, which means with the minus they'll rotate counterclockwise. With the plus value they'll rotate clockwise. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into physics, air, and in here we've got a thing called turbulence field. Now what this is a bit like a fractal noise. It's hidden and it's used to kind of displace or change the position of the particles. I'm just going to use it to affect the position. So rather than them falling dead straight, they'll kind of meander down slightly, a little bit like snow would. So I've set the position to 100. Okay, and I'm just going to adjust the scale of this so it's smaller and also not quite as complex. If you're familiar with fractal noise, then you'll kind of recognise these values. They're very similar. Lastly, I'm going to adjust the evolution, just so it doesn't evolve quite as fast. So the snowflakes are nearly done. Last thing to do here is just switch on, comp settings is already switched on because we duped it from the last one. So that's all good. So let's just scrub through here and see what happens. Okay, that all looks okay, apart from at this point when we've moved to the next shot, we've still got quite a few snowflakes here. We don't really want those there, so we need to get rid of them somehow. So if I open up the camera, jump back to these keyframes, this is the point that the camera tracks across. If I select the snow layer, Alt-P to set a key for that, K to jump to the next keyframe, just zoom out slightly. Now I can drag my snowflake layer so it's off the side, trim it to that point, and we're done. So here's a quick RAM preview. I haven't got motion blur on for now, but you can see everything's working as expected. The clouds are animating, the snowflakes are all falling. All we need to do now is add the trails on the back of the guy on the motorbike. So I'm going to save it first and then we'll start that. Well, I've saved that, excuse me. Just fold these up and move back here. Let's just position it where the kind of guy on the motorbike is sort of level. Just press F2 to deselect the layers. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but there's someone kind of digging the road up outside. I hope it isn't interfering with the audio, but it's being a bit noisy. Sorry about that. Now what I want to do is I want to add some trails in. I want to attach them to the guy on the motorbike. Now, how we're going to go about doing that? You could add a null object and then use expressions to link it to this and position it in the right place, or maybe parenting it. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use a light. With particular, you can actually add lights into your scene and then you can specify that as the emitter type, and it uses that point in space, which is pretty handy because obviously you can animate a light moving around 3D. So first of all, layer new light. It needs to be a kind of point light or a spotlight to work, and then we can call it emitter 01. You have to give it a name for particular to recognise it. I'll show you where the options for that are in a moment. Okay, so we've added a light. You can see it's already affecting the comp and changing all the colours. Don't really worry about that because we're going to switch the light off once we've got it in position. So first of all, I'm going to drag that down just above the motocross bike, select both and press P. Now I can copy the position values from the motocross bike onto the emitter. I've set the values the same. You can see there's the light now. So it's just a matter of zooming in and positioning that where we want it. So I'm going to make sure that it's here on the back of the exhaust. You can just drag the axes like this. If you select the correct layer, that is. Try again. Okay, there we go. Just move it up a tiny bit. I think that looks about right. So now all we need to do is just parent that to the motocross bike, and then as we move, there it is. You can see it's moving with the guy. All good. So we just need to add the particle effect to that now. So again, I'm going to just drag in a solid and add particular to it. I'm going to put it underneath the motocross bike, effect particular, and just rename this solid. I've renamed that and I've just adjusted the comp window so we can see what's going on. So if we come to our emitter type here and we choose light, we immediately see particles coming out. If I just double click the light, you'll notice that it's set to orange. That's obviously where I've done that in a previous test and it's still keeping the same colour, but that's the colour that we want it, so that's cool. We can hide our light so we can see what's going on properly. Come back to our particular. If we notice and we go to options, we have this section here, light emitters. This is where you give the name of the light that you're using, so particular knows where to link to. I'm just going to put 01 in there because that's what we've called it. If there was only one in our comp, we could just leave it, but we're going to add another one. Okay, that. Now, to make a line, we'd want the particles to actually not move at all, just to emit lots of them. So if we set all the velocity values to 0 first of all, okay, we're sort of getting a line there. And we set our emitter size to 0, so they're all coming from exactly the same point. And let's set our amount of particles to 1,000, we should get a line. Cool. It's a little bit big and the line's going on forever, so let's just adjust the particle size. Let's set the time first of all, so it only lives for 1.5 seconds, or sorry, half a second. No feather on it. Size, say 2. Okay, and if we go to this bit, size over life, in particular you have these little graphs. You can actually draw on these, and you can see where I've affected the size over life, it's reflected it here. There's also these little graphs down the side. We can just click this and there we go, we've got a ramp down. So as the particles get older, they get smaller, and that gives us this kind of streak effect. So that's looking pretty cool. As I said before, the colour actually comes from the light, so it's using this orange colour. So if we go to the effect again, set colour at birth is greyed out, you can't actually change that. You can set colour over life. Colour over life will use this gradient, so you see it starting red, ending blue. And you can also random from gradient, which then picks a random number, random colour even, from the gradient. We're going to use at birth and use the light colour, that's absolutely fine. So now that's set up, I'm just going to duplicate that and add one so that there's kind of line coming out of his helmet as well. Now this second effect, if we go into options, is still going to be using emitter 01. So what we need to do here is just simply call it emitter 02, or whatever name you want really, but I'm going to call it that. Duplicate this light, so now we've got one called emitter 02, and if I just switch that on, and I'm just going to reposition that just behind his crash helmet. There we go. And we can just switch that layer off as well now, because obviously we don't want the light to affect the 3D layers. So that's it, the first part's done. I'll just do a quick round preview of that and we'll move on. Here's the round preview. Everything seems to be working okay. So we can save it and move on. If we move to the next shot, we can see that the marker kind of cone things, I'm just going to switch motion blur off so it refreshes a little bit quicker. Okay, that's the keyframe for the end of the camera move. So you've got these cones that are kind of buoying out of the sea. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some splashes to these. I'm going to just make one splash in a pre-comp and then position it under each one. I've created a new comp, 512 by 288, 2 seconds long, added a solid and then added the particular effect. I'm just going to adjust some of the parameters. First thing I'm going to do is just put that to 288 because I want it to emit from the bottom of the layer. Okay, I want it to be directional. I want the particles to go up, so I'm just going to adjust this to -90. By default, when you set it to directional, the particles kind of travel away from you. So setting that to -90, they should go up. Nope. I think they're actually going down there. Let's just pull that out and see the mistake I've made. Yeah, so it should have actually been +90. There we go. I don't want them to emit from a single point like this. I want them to emit from a wider area. Also, I think the directional spread could be slightly higher. So it's set to a point emitter. Let's just set that to box. And if we set the X, say, about 160 or something, and then these can all be set to 0 because we don't want any depth to it. So let's have a look now. Okay. So the particles are emitting continually. I think for a splash there'd probably be a burst of them and then that would be it. So I'm going to set this to say 250, add a key, jump forward to 5 frames and set that to 0 so the amount of particles will gradually decrease. So we should get a little burst. There we go. So I think we've set up the emitter okay. Let's have a look at the particle types. We don't want them to live for 3 seconds. It's only a 2-second comp. So I'm just going to set this to 1 second. Get rid of the feather on the sphere because I think that should be more graphical like the rest of the comp, and increase the size to say 15 with a bit of randomness in there, 25. Okay, so now it looks like this. They will just pop off. So rather than them pop off, I'm going to have them scale down. So we can go to size over life, and I'm going to check this graph here, so they kind of scale up to full size and then scale down. Like so. I don't actually think that they're travelling fast enough and going up high enough, so I'm just going to go back to the emitter settings and adjust the velocity. It's set to 100, so I'm just going to set that to 250 and see what that's like. That's a bit more like it. So they kind of splash quite fast. I think that also we could adjust the opacity so that they fade out as well. So if we just go to opacity over life, just set that to ramp down. Cool. I think the only thing we need to do now is just kind of give it a little bit of gravity for a slightly more realism. Not that we're after a particularly realistic effect. So in physics we can go gravity, I will set that to 100. And let's just RAM preview that. Okay, I think we're good to go with that. So we jump back to the main comp and position that in place. I want the splash to appear just as these cone things kind of pop out the water, so I'll just set one up and then I'll duplicate it for all the others. So it's somewhere around here. So if we go to our project window and drag our splash comp in, I'm going to put that in front of C front and trim that layer to there. At the moment it's still a 2D layer. Okay, well we need it to be 3D so it works with the camera and everything like that, so we'll just switch that onto 3D. Now it's disappeared because it's off the side here. So I'm going to drag that in, zoom in slightly. I know the particles are emitted from the bottom, so I'm just going to press Y and then adjust the anchor point so that's down here at the bottom. I mean, that's not necessary, it just makes it a little bit easier when I'm positioning the layer, because I know that where the axis is the kind of point where the particles are emitting from. Oh, pressed the wrong button there. For these front particles, I'm just going to scale it down slightly. I think it's a bit big. And also I'm going to add the fill effect, which is generate fill, and then using the eyedropper, just pick this blue, and then that will blend in with the sea quite nicely. I've done a quick RAM preview. It's looking okay. I think the opacity needs adjusting on the particles, but I mean that's just kind of personal preference really. So if I alt double click the splash, come back to the effect, I'm just going to adjust the opacity over life. Instead of them getting fainter from beginning to end, what I'm going to do is select this, because I kind of only want them to fade out at the end, and then you can draw in here and just make this a solid line so they're fully opaque until that point. And that should look a little bit better. Yeah, they only just fade out right at the last minute then. So that's cool. And here we go, that's what that looks like. So now I've done that, I'm just going to rename it and then reposition them all. They'll obviously have to be moved in Z, but it's just a case of positioning them in front of each marker and setting the endpoint at the point where they come through the water. I've positioned the first two onto the middle section. I've renamed it middle, just to show you the easiest way to position that is to open up the C, and then we can see the kind of Z value that it needs to be. So we set that to 1900, and then it's just a matter of dragging it into position over here. Like so. I've also adjusted the fill colour so it's the same light blue, and I've had to scale the splash back up to 100% because it's quite a bit further back in Z. It was a bit too small, but that's fine. So I'm just going to repeat that procedure for the other splashes. The splashes are all made, all in position, everything's working as it should, so I'm going to just save again and move on. Next thing we're going to do is add a trail onto the back of the aeroplane. Right, let's get on and add the particles to the aeroplane. You could do it in the previous example like the motorbike guy and use a light and kind of parent it to it, but I'm going to show you how to do it with expressions this time. It's pretty simple, to be honest. Let's just select the plane, press P to open our position. Now I'm going to just drag on a solid. Okay, this is the solid that I add particular to, so I'm just going to add that effect. Let's move to the point in time where the plane is off screen, which is somewhere around here, and we can trim that layer so it starts there. If we go to the effect, I'm just going to kind of put some keyframes on here for now. And then I can press U, and that immediately shows the keys that I've got. I don't actually want those keys, but it's just a quick way of bringing up only those two parameters. So what we need to do is we need to link these position values here on the particular to the position values on the plane. If we just move into the planes in shot, let's just move back slightly, and I select that, you can see that the anchor point is kind of near the back of the plane. I'm sure if you do this project you can kind of draw a better plane. It's perfectly adequate for this class. Adding an expression to these is as simple as holding down Alt to click the stopwatch, and now what we can do is use the pick whip, drag it onto position. Okay, this is going to create a slight this is going to create a small expression. It's not complicated at all really, but it's because it's accessing two values, so it creates a slight array, creates a variable called temporary, and then it uses that value on position 0, position 1, x, y. We do the same for position z, and we just drag that up to position. Okay, and here you see we've got another expression added, even simpler. The only thing we need to change is where it says position 0, because that's the x value, and we've got x, y, z, and this needs to be the z value, so it's 0, 1, 2. So in here we just put 2, and there we go. We can immediately see the particles are emitting from the back of the plane, so that's all worked as it should. Now it's just a matter of going in and adjusting the particle settings again. So if I select this, I'm just going to call this particular plane, and then let's have a look at the particle settings in the effects window. I want it to emit from a point, which it is, quite a few more particles I think. Notice that these values are pink. That means that they're being controlled by an expression, so that's quite a handy visual cue that After Effects gives you. I'm just going to slow the velocity down to 50, come down to the particle settings. I'm going to make the life shorter as well, so it's just 1 second. No feather, so they're solid circles. They just need to be a bit bigger, and perhaps add some randomness to them as well. All pretty straightforward. The only other things I'm going to do is adjust the size over life. Now I want them to start really small and scale up. So we can select this graph here, and then there's a flip option. There you go, now you can see they're quite small when they scale up. And with the opacity over life, I want the opposite of that, so they kind of fade out over time. The last thing to do is just to set the colour, and I'm going to set the colour to be the same as the aeroplane, that blue. So there you go. That's our trail set up. Didn't take too long. Well, the last thing to do with that actually is just trim it when the kind of plane's off the screen. Somewhere around there will do. Great stuff. Just going to save again. The next thing I'm going to do is add in kind of like a flock of birds. This is using another feature of Particular, and what you can do is you can bring a light into the scene, whereas before what we did was we attached the emitter point to the light, so the particles were kind of being emitted wherever the light was. This time what we're going to do is we're going to create a kind of piece of motion, animate the position of the light, and then you can make the particles follow that motion path. So what we can do is we can sort of kind of create flocking, and you could use that for shoals of fish. What we're going to do is we're going to create a flock of birds. I'm going to make a really simple animation for the bird. I've got a kind of bird wing Illustrator file here. So I'm going to create a new comp with that and just change a few of the values. I've added the bird wing Illustrator file into a new comp. I've moved the anchor point down here and moved the whole layer over to the left. It's a 4-second comp and it's 200 by 100. So now I'm just going to animate the kind of wing beating. You could do this with keyframes and then offset them or loop them. I'm going to do it with an expression. So if we just press R for rotation, alt-click the stopwatch to bring up the expression editor. over here we can click on the little arrow, pop up, and this has got quite a few expression kind of parameters and everything already set up for us. So if we go to JavaScript math, and we can choose math.sine value, this creates a sine wave. And what we're going to do is we're going to base that on the time of the comp. Now the values of the sine wave will go from 1 to -1. We obviously want it to be different than that. At the moment we can't see what's going on really, so if we just check this little box and then go to our graph editor, if we select rotation, down the bottom here I've enabled the expression editor, show expression editor here, so we can kind of adjust our expression and look at the curve that it's creating. If we adjust this and then by multiplying time by pi, we put math.pi. Okay, you can see what's happened now is the sine wave is looping, so every whole second it becomes 0 again. So after 2 seconds you can see it's done one full loop. What that means is that this comp is now essentially loopable. It's still only going from 0 to 1 and back down to -1. So we need to adjust that value and maybe make it kind of loop a few more times in that comp. I don't think that'll be fast enough. So if we first of all multiply the whole amount by, say, 15, okay, you can now see that our sine wave is going from 0 to 15 and then down to -15. So as we move this, you can see we've got much more rotation. It's still not doing it enough times. I think probably 4 times as many beats. So if we come in here and just put multiplied by 4, you can see the sine wave is now repeating a lot more. And there we go. I find that working with the graph editor when working with expressions like this makes it much simpler to see what's going on. So now I'm just going to duplicate this and create the other wing. First of all, select scale and set the X to -100 so it flips it round. If we come to our rotation values, this has still got the same expression as the bottom layer. Now we could leave it like this, but it's easier if we kind of link the second one to the first rotation values. Otherwise, if we want to change anything, we've got to change them both every time. So I'm just going to alt-click here to get rid of that expression, then do it again to create a new one. Drag it down on the pick whip, and there we go. Okay, so they're now going to be rotating the same. So you're getting this kind of side-to-side movement. We need to invert the values of this top rotation. Now the easiest way to do that is simply just to times it by -1. And there we go. So that's cool. The only thing I'm going to do is just add a small shape layer to get rid of this ugly part at the bottom. So there we have a really basic bird. I'm sure that you guys can make something a lot more interesting, but this will suffice for now. So I'm going to take this into the main comp and set up the particle system for that. Back in the main comp, I've dragged the bird wing composition, placed it at the bottom and just turned the visibility off. I've also noticed that I haven't trimmed these layers for the motorbike helmet and stuff. There's no reason that these layers need to carry on to the end, so we can just trim those off. Okay, I've trimmed those. If you're using custom particles with particular, you need to make sure that the layer that it's referencing is actually present underneath the particular layer. For instance, if we started kind of particular up here, it wouldn't be able to reference this layer. It needs to start at the same time. So I'm just going to start that layer there, so that when I add the particle systems, it's underneath and it can be referenced. So to add the particle system, I'm just going to drag in a solid and add particular. I've added the solid with particular. Now I'm going to add a light, and I need to call this motion path. One. Okay, that. Also set the in point for this light to start here. I'm just going to drag it down as well so it's next to the actual layer that is referencing it. Oh, that one. Now it's just a case of animating the light and then telling particular for the particles to follow that path. So I'll open up position. I'm going to put it right at the back. I'm going to put it like 2,400. If you remember, the clouds were about 2,500 and the snowflakes were about 2,000, so it's sort of going to sit in between there. And now it's a case of just setting some keys. I want the light to start off screen over here and the birds to kind of come down and then maybe just go off screen up here. So I'm just going to set the keys for that. I've set the first key so the light's just off the side over here on the right, and then the last key so it's just up here. I'm now just going to go to the middle and then I'm going to drag this down like so. Actually, I think it needs to be lower. I'm going to set that to -120. That's a bit better. To give it the sense of 3D, I'm going to bring it forward on Z, say 1500. Okay. Now we haven't got very good interpolation on our keys at the moment, it's linear, so if we just click on the word position, right click on that, and go keyframe interpolation, spatial interpolation, and let's set that to auto Bezier. There we go. So now the light's following along that path exactly as we want. We can add our particles and we can set them to use that path. I'm going to switch that layer off now because we don't really need to see it. Jump to the last key and trim that as well. We can fold that up, so let's go on with the particles. We've already added particular to it. The first thing to do is to position the emitter where the light starts. So if we open up our position for the light, come back here, we need to put those values in to our emitter position. If we don't do that, what will happen is the particles will still follow the path, but they'll be offsetting, their position will be offset. By placing the emitter at the beginning of the path, they'll all follow nicely. So jump to the first key and then just copy these values up to here. And the emitter's in the correct position now, so if we come down to physics and open up air, we have this option here, motion path. If we click on it, then we've got these numbers. Now we've got motion path 1, so I'm going to choose that. I've just done a RAM preview so you can see what's happening so far. You can see up here the particles are kind of coming from one point, they're emitting continually, they're sort of spreading out, but they are actually following that path now. Back at the beginning of the particle layer, I'm just going to key the emitter. We don't want it to emit 100 particles continually, we just want like a small flock of birds. So at frame 0, I'm going to set a key for no particles, and then I'm going to jump forward, say 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, maybe, and go kind of 50 particles, and then jump forward 10, and set that back to 0. So now we've got kind of no particles, it goes up to 50 and then back down. So let's change some settings in here. I think I want it as a box rather than coming from a point, so it doesn't have this kind of thin point here. And because it's a box, we can make it slightly bigger. Okay, the velocity is set to 100. I'm just going to lower that because otherwise they're going to spread out too much. And I might just adjust the velocity random so they're not all kind of travelling at the same speed. Now it's just a matter of choosing our bird particle as a custom particle, and it should be working. So we come in here and we just choose custom. The layer we want is our bird wing. Time sampling. Now what we want to do here is we want it to loop, because if you remember we made it loopable with our sine wave. And we can say start at birth loop, but what that will mean is that all the birds will start at the same point, so they'll all look very, very similar. If we just say random loop, it will start from a random frame and it will loop, so they'll all be slightly out of sync. And we just need to scale them up. So let's set the size, 50. Okay, there we go, we can actually see our birds now. I've also adjusted the size random so they're not all kind of the same size. And here's a little preview. As you can see, they're following the path from the light really well. It kind of gives a kind of flocking simulation. It's pretty basic flocking, but you know, it can work for some situations. I've trimmed these layers because we don't need those layers after that point in time. The last thing we do is quite a simple little particle system. We're just going to have some arrows kind of flying up here as the lines grow out. So I need to kind of create an emitter and put it so that it's sort of hiding behind this bit of C in between there and the cones. So we can look at the C, which is C back, press P, and we can see where it needs to be. So that's 2,900. So if we put our emitter at 3,000, we know it's going to be behind that. And then it's just a matter of adjusting the X and Y. Okay, just grab another solid, drag it in, place it behind the C. I'm going to rename it and position it. I've adjusted the position over here of the particular effect, renamed the layer and added the effect obviously first. So now you can just see the particles starting to emit from that point. So we need to change it so that it uses a custom particle that we're going to make, and also so that it's the width of the comp and that the particles are all travelling upwards. So that's very similar to the splash. So I'm just going to do that and just show you the settings I've changed. I've set it to box, directional, with an X rotation of 90. The velocity I've set to 470. I'm just going to drag the X size out so it's wider. And also the Y size, just so it has a little bit of depth. Z size doesn't really matter because it's hidden down below. You could set that to 0 if you wanted, but we're fine with this as it is. So now we see all the particles going up. Go back to the project window, and if we go to our Illustrator folder, I've got some arrows here. I'm just going to select them all, drag them into a new comp. It's going to single comp is what we want, and sequence layers, that's ideal. Okay, well it's not quite actually, because I don't really want them to be 2 seconds each, so I'm just going to select them, trim them to there, and then Alt, right bracket, right square bracket, and now I can keyframe assistant, sequence layers. I could have set that in the original make comp dialog, but I got it wrong. I've also changed the duration of this comp, so obviously we haven't got loads of empty space at the end of it. So they're just kind of different coloured arrows. It's quite simple. They're the colours that we've been using in the rest of the main comp. So I can go back to my main comp and drag this in. I'll just put it up here first of all. And then drag that in. I kind of tend to put my particles always at the bottom so I know where they all are, rather than having them kind of scattered up and down the timeline. I'll switch that off as well. We can come back to our particle arrows, hit E, go to the effect, and now we can set the particle type to be custom again as before, and choose our arrow layers. What I want to do is I want to pick a random still frame, so they're all slightly different. Okay, so we can't see them yet. I think that's possibly to do with the size. Actually, it probably is the size, but I think it's something else. If you remember before, I told you that the layer that you were referencing needs to match up with the beginning of the particle layers. And well, it's not doing that because there's our layer here. So if we just go to the in point of our particle layer, select the beige arrow and then left bracket to set its in point there. There you go, so now we can see it. So that's what the problem was. And we can just go back and set the size. I think they should be bigger than that. And I think they should also have some randomness. If we scrub forward, see what happens as they come up to the logo. Okay, they need to kind of die before that point, so they're living too long. So let's set the time 2.5 seconds for their life. That's cool. So now I think what will happen is they'll just pop off. So rather than that happening, we can just adjust the size over life as we did in the previous examples. So I'm just going to select this and then, as before, kind of fill in that top bit. Whoops, did it wrong. There we go. So now just before the very end, they're going to scale down slightly. I think we're pretty much done. The only thing we need to set on this now is motion blur, and I'm going to set that the same as the others. Subframe sample with 32 samples, but still based on the comp settings, so I can just switch it on and off here. So here's the final animation playing through what we've learned in this class. Basically setting up a few different particle systems using particular. First of all, we did the clouds, and we looked at how you can kind of create several animated particles, put them all into one comp, and then split that up when you reference it so that you can create a variety of animated particles. Then we did the snowflakes, which were pretty basic. Then we looked at using lights to attach emitter points to, where we did the trail from the back of the crash helmet and the exhaust. In the next section, we made the little splashes. They were quite simple. And then we looked at using a simple expression to attach to another layer's anchor point for the plane. Then we animated a light and used the path, the motion path from that light to make the particles travel along it. Finally, we did the arrows, which used a kind of random custom particle. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'll give you this project file as a kind of start point and an end point as it is now, so you can look at all the settings and everything that I've used, but you'll also have a fresh project to start with and you can build your own. I've got a couple of ideas for an assignment for this, so I'll post that in the forums. If anyone's got any questions, please just put it in the forums. So that's it for this week. I'm really sorry we didn't get to look at form. I did say maybe, but we ran out of time there. Hopefully the techniques I've showed you in particular will be useful. Next week what we're going to do is we're going to look at cutting up kind of photos, bitmap images. I'm going to make a character and just do some really simple animation on it. So I look forward to that, and I look forward to seeing you all in the forums. Have a good week.